Get started. Thank you very much for sticking around for this presentation, and welcome those of you who are online. I hope you enjoy this presentation. So this is a presentation. It's turned into a presentation. I was thinking maybe a class of some sort, but I've gone in the presentation route. And I'll tell you why, and I've called it the 400 Years of Silence between the Testaments. So as you know, I've been doing this ongoing study of the minor prophets. It's been going on for about 3 years now. We started back in the fall of 2019, I believe. And we started with the book of Hosea, and we just worked our way through all the prophets. And as of now, we are only 2 chapters short of finishing Malachi, the very last book of the minor prophets. So we're just about done that whole series 3 years later. And we had our last class back in November. And it was asked, well, we're going to finish Malachi, and we're like in the Christmas season. So let's take a look. It would be nice to know what was going on in that 400-year gap between Malachi and the New Testament. So I thought, well, this is a pretty good thing to look into. I'm sure I can find out something. And I think I was a little bit naive at that time because I realized when I started looking into this that I bit off a little bit more than I can chew. Because at first I thought, yeah, I'm sure I could find some information. I'll throw together something. There's probably a few little things that took place in that 400-year gap. But oh my goodness, there was so much stuff that I found that I was faced with the challenge of, what am I going to do with all this information? And I seriously had to limit the amount of stuff that I put in this presentation. Now, first of all, I do hope to keep this under an hour. I don't have my watch on me, but an hour's time is enough, I think, to get through something like this. But really, the amount of information I found could lead to a whole series of classes, and to go all the stuff that went on during that 400-year period. So what I decided to do, I was like, okay, I don't have time for this or this or this. I just kept it to a very slim slither of pages in my study Bible that gives a nice sum up of the main highlights of the stuff that went on during that 400-year period. So that's what I did. And even in that small little slither, there was a wealth of information. And at first, when I was putting this class together, I was putting up huge chunks of text on the screen, which look a lot like this. And I would just have you read it, basically, or just talk about it. But then it would just turn into a lecture. And that's just not my style. I really like to visualize as much as possible. And that's what I decided to do. With all this information, I'm thinking, how am I best going to present this? And so this is really going to be a visualization of some of the things that took place during that 400-year period. First of all, a disclaimer. I'm just going to put it out there that I am not, underline not, a historian. So I can tell you about the significance of some of the stories in the Word and tell you what they mean and how they apply to our lives today. But going back into history and collecting information and putting it into some sort of presentation is just not my thing. So this is sort of new for me to go through this kind of thing in this kind of style. And I am fully aware that there are those among you who know very much about the stuff that went on during this 400-year period. So if you find something that is wrong or flawed, which will probably be lots, feel free to speak up because I'm not an expert in this field. All right, so that's just out there. This is the 400 years of silence, so let's get to it. We're just going to wait until Christmas. Silence. Nothing happened, right? Obviously not. Okay. I want to tell you a little bit about the nature of divine revelation, because this is something interesting to consider as we go through this. So right there we have a timeline, and we can see my laser. We have past and future. And I'll just put up a brief history of the churches as we're told from the Heavenly Doctrine. So everyone's familiar with these acronyms. Most ancient church, the time of Adam. Ancient church, right around Tower of Babel. Jewish church after the flood, down to the Christian church, time of Jesus, and then all the way to the new church, which took place after the second coming. So we're going to put the birth of Jesus right there, which was in between that time period, which obviously was the beginning of the Christian church. We'll look at the Old Testament here, and there's a New Testament, and then the Heavenly Doctrine. Those are the times the rough times that those testaments or books were written. So we have Moses and we have Malachi. So Moses sort of marks the beginning of the writing of the Old Testament, where Malachi is the end of the writing of the Old Testament. He completed the Old Testament with his final prophecy. Now, the Old Testament really does cover a time period of roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years. If you consider the earlier books of Genesis, where it talks about Adam, the most ancient church, which was way before Moses' time. So when you consider that, then there's a whole lot of time covered in the Old Testament, but the recording of the Old Testament didn't really happen until after the flood, where we start getting actual historical characters in the Word. Eber, I think, is the first actual historical character mentioned in Genesis. And then you have a couple of others, and there's this guy named Enoch, I believe, who was the first person to actually write stuff down. So everything that we learn about in the early chapters of Genesis was oral tradition, passed down verbally through the generations, until Enoch wrote stuff down, which became a resource for Moses eventually, who then took all that information and then started writing the first 5 books of Genesis as we know it. So Moses is the first person to write the Old Testament, which really covers events that took place way before his time. And then Malachi finishes it off. But angels and divine appearances, as we know of, are mostly recorded, and emphasis on recorded from about 2300 BC to 430 BC, the end of Malachi. We do learn about the most ancient people, the time of Adam. They actually spoke to spirits and angels face to face, just like we do. So divine activity was just a normal, common thing among them. And then when it got later after the flood into the Jewish church, then the divine activity became more exaggerated and pronounced as a way to get their attention with drastic miracles and other kind of events. But then we have this time of silence after Malachi, and then a lot more divine activity took place after the Lord's birth, even before his birth, when the angel came to Zechariah and also Joseph and Mary. And so all this divine activity took place with the Lord's life on earth, with his miracles and such, all the way up to about 90 AD, which is when John witnessed the events recorded in Revelation. And then there's another period of silence after that New Testament is written. So we got the 4 Gospels, Book of Revelation. You can consider Acts and Epistles as well. And then there's this almost 2,000-year period before the Last Judgment took place and the heavenly doctrine was completed. Right, so we have the Gospel writers, and everybody knows what SW means. Right? Swedenborg. Okay? So, in a historical sense, this is what I'm getting at. In a historical sense, divine revelation as recorded in the Word is not very consistent, because you have the Old Testament with all its divine activity that took place in this time period. Then nothing took place here. Then all of a sudden the Lord is born and the New Testament is written with all these great events taking place. And then nothing's taking place here, and then the Last Judgment takes place, which was a spiritual event, not necessarily something that happened on earth. So it seems like divine revelation, as it's recorded, seems to come and go in batches. New Testament, centuries later, Old Testament, centuries later, New Testament, and centuries later, heavenly doctrine. But these gaps of silence here are not meant to be mistaken for divine absence. So it doesn't mean the Lord is not off the scene anymore. He's very much at work, and we even get plenty of passages in the doctrine that says that if divine activity or influence or influx stopped even for just 1 second at any point in time, the human race would just instantly perish. So the Lord is very much there, and divine providence is very much at work, setting things up for the next big revelation to be recorded. So right there is our main focus for today. And the question really is, what's divine providence doing to set the stage, so to speak, for the years leading up to the Lord's birth? And we can observe divine providence by looking at the events of history, which is what we're doing today. All right. Now, as I go on, if you have questions or comments that are relevant, please feel free to raise your hand and we can have that kind of discussion. But I'll just keep going through in the meantime. I want to just say a couple of things about the consistency of content, because I was saying that the recording of divine content is inconsistent. But the consistency of actual content that is recorded is pretty harmonious. You take a look at these two passages here. This first one from Daniel, talking about his vision of the Lord, how his body was like beryl, his face is the appearance of lightning, eyes of fire, feet and arms like brass, and the voice of a multitude. And then you get this vision here from Revelation that John saw with the Lord. Similar things, his head and hair white like wool, eyes were like fire, feet like brass, and his voice is the sound of many waters. You get some little bits of differences, but a lot of them are very much the same. And these two visions took place centuries after each other, like 600 years almost. And just see how similar they are. So it just tells you how spiritual things are not related to natural things, but they come into a natural perception. And you see that also with this prophecy from Zechariah. He described these horses that he saw. There were red horses, there were black horses, white horses, strong horses, and you can compare that with the four horsemen in Revelation that John saw: the white horse, then the red horse, and the black horse, and the pale horse. Now, the meaning between these two are different. The meaning of the horses are different, but the vision is still very much the same. Different colored horses. Again, centuries apart from each other, but very much the same. There's a lot of consistency in the written word, in the content. All right, and so it goes. This quote here from Malachi is the very last verse of the very last chapter of the very last book of the Old Testament. This is how the Old Testament ends. And this is basically the message that people were given to hold on to the end or till the time of the Lord's coming. Shall turn the heart of their fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Kind of a grim note to end, right? Like a bad news for you guys. I mean, it's sort of promising, fathers and children and so on. There's going to be some harmony, but lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. So it kind of tells you that the Lord's going to come. It's a prophecy about the Lord's coming. He's going to come. He's going to do some great, amazing things and introduce a lot of new things. But according to the doctrine, and this is just true in real life too, that in order for something new to be established, something old has to die first. And so I kind of think, and I should have verified it, but this smiting earth with a curse, I think, is the ending, the official ending of the Jewish church so that the Christian church can take its place. But it had to last until that time. So just a couple more notes. Although the Old Testament was considered complete at this point at the end of Malachi, there were many events that took place which solidified Jewish ideology, all right, which providentially prepared the way for the Lord's coming. So we're going to take a look and observe what was going on with the Jewish nation specifically. Because what we also learn from the doctrine is that the Jewish church was the official universal church, at least holding up a representation of the Lord's church on earth until his coming. So the universal church is basically like the heart and the lungs of the world. It used to be the most ancient church, then it was the ancient church, and now it's the Jewish church. And then when the Lord came, they no longer held that title of universal church, then the Christian church became the universal church. But they had to carry that representation all the way until the Lord's coming. Okay? Yes.
On there was not on the Jewish church. It was the judgment on the ancient church.
Yes. And that was a good point, too. I don't want to go back, but when you had that timeline of the ancient church with the Jewish church, the doctrine do can verify. I didn't find a passage, but it sort of said that the Jewish church is like an extension of the ancient church. And the ancient church really is, it goes all the way until the Lord's advent. So that's a good point. Okay, so here we go. Does anybody recognize what this is? You do? It's? Yes, there we go. So here is the Mediterranean coast, all right? There is the Red Sea with the River Jordan. That dot there is Jerusalem, all right? And down here we have Egypt and Assyrians over here and so on. And so this is basically the stage of the world, all through the Old Testament up to the Lord's coming. So if you want to know what's going on in the world at the time during this 400-year period, this is where it happened because we have so many world powers going through this region here where the Jews were stationed most of the time. So I'm going to talk about the Persians first, and notice the time period, 560 to about 330 BC. That's a rough time period. But 560 is during the time of the prophets. So a lot of the prophets were still writing at that time, like Daniel and the later minor prophets had his visions and their prophecies took place during the Persian period. But pay attention to this time period as we go through the slides because that number is just going to keep getting lower and lower and lower. So consider it like a countdown to the Lord's coming. Kind of cool. Okay, so the Persians. We have a group of people here. These are the Jews in Jerusalem. Remember, this is a visualization of what's going on. This is pretty awesome. All right, simple. Less is more. All right. So the Jews actually managed pretty well under Persian rule, as I learned, because they were permitted to keep on with their practices and their religion without any interference. The high priest, though, did work pretty closely with the Syrian officials, but that ensured them a certain amount of freedom, which they wouldn't be able to get otherwise. But at the same time, politics was introduced into the procedure of getting a high priest in place, which led to contests. And contests then eventually led to jealousy and sometimes even murder. So there's a lot of good and bad, pros and cons to all the things that happened to the Jewish nation starting now and throughout the rest of history. Now, we have certain world powers. So the Syrians, who are governing at this time, are trying to overthrow Greece. All right? They want to get rid of Greece, while Egypt is trying to overthrow Persia. And these poor Jews are stuck in the middle. They're in the crossfire. They don't really have a way to go. So apparently, Artaxerxes III, who was ruling in Palestine or Egypt at that time, led a revolt against Persia. And he recruited Jews to fight along with him. But that didn't work out so well. So the Persians ended up deporting some of the Jews to Babylon, the Babylonian captivity, whereas other Jews went into Egypt or fled into Egypt to get away from Nebuchadnezzar. Now, those who were in Egypt sort of built themselves up a little bit and became mercenaries. They wanted to be able to defend themselves, and they built a big temple there in Egypt. And from there, they communicated with various other Jews, Samaritans and Judeans. So that's what I learned, at least. Am I on the track so far? Maybe? Okay. But that's all I know about the Persians, all right? It's a long time period, but that's kind of a very, very rough gist of what went on and what happened to the Jews. So they're dispersed into different groups. That's the idea, at least. So far, so good? Yes?
Jews back to Jerusalem.
I don't know if it was the Persians who did that.
I think it was the Persians, was it?
The Assyrians.
Maybe. I didn't find out. I didn't get that deep.
See, when I took a history course many years ago. Okay.
Yep. Sure. Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that the Assyrians did, and the Assyrians were the ones that took them back in Babylon. And
Right.
it was Cyrus the Great originally under the Persians who really, they call him the Great because he was really great. He allowed them to practice their own religion, as you say. And so the ones that wanted to move back could go back. They didn't send them back.
No, but didn't they also donate money so they could build the temple again?
Yeah, that would happen much later, I think. But the important thing that happened, and I don't know if you're going to mention this, during the captivity and when they went down to Egypt, is the synagogue movement. Are you going to talk about that?
No.
Okay, so because they didn't have the temple anymore, and the Jews were not supposed to build a temple was only allowed to be in Jerusalem,
Right.
they started the synagogue movement, which was a teaching.
Right.
And it wasn't the whole ritualistic stuff that they were told to do at the temple, because the temple was gone. And so the synagogue movement was is when the rabbis, the teachers, started, and that's what kept the religion on the minds of people.
Cool. Well, that's good. That's good to know. So I'm getting help with my presentation. I think that's important because by myself, I'm thinking I'm going to miss a lot of stuff. Okay, so let's move on. Then we have Alexander the Great, who succeeded the Persian Empire. That's what I learned. There he is. So this is a time period roughly between 330 to 320 BC. Oh wait, let me go back. So Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire, and he's under the influence of Aristotle at the time, and he really believed that Greek culture would unify the world. So he set out on this great conquest to get all the nations on board. Although he conquered many nations, he didn't have any problem against the Jews. He didn't have any reason to conquer them or destroy them. And he was considered a friend to them. And apparently there was this guy named Jaddua, who was a high priest at that time, and he claimed that the prophecy in Daniel came true through Alexander the Great, specifically the one where the goat is mentioned in Daniel 8, chapter 8:21. He said, the rough goat is the king of Greece, Alexander the Great, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And you read a little bit more about that description. The goat's feet don't touch the ground, and he says that's because Alexander's conquest is so great and swift that he didn't have time to actually run his feet. Now, obviously, this isn't what that passage means, but it at least was a good gesture of friendship between the Jews and Alexander. Alexander goes to Egypt, and he builds a city called Alexandria, is what I know. And there he encouraged the Jews to settle in a similar fashion to that of the Greeks. So they were like on the same level, basically. They got a lot of privileges, which was great, but at the same time, this is also when he spread Hellenistic culture throughout the regions. And that introduced a more modernized way of life and more structures, which for the Jews, they saw as could be a temptation, because they don't want to mix new things with old tradition and so on. So it was beneficial in many ways, but it did cause some to mingle their ways with other races, while others stayed true to their religion or their beliefs, their traditions. And so this kind of becomes the source of the beginning of separations of different various Jewish groups. Alexander the Great dies, and as a result, the kingdom that he established, his empire, became divided among different groups, such as the Ptolemies. Is that the way to say it? Ptolemy? Okay, Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. And these two groups fought each other constantly for land and power. So again, the Jews are stuck in the crossfire. So that's the end of Alexander the Great. So, yeah? Sure? Mm, right. Kind of like Springfield. You can see them all over the place. Yeah. Oh, yeah, he died like 30, something like that. Yeah, I didn't realize he was so young when he did all that. Yeah, quite an accomplishment. Yes. The Ptolemies were of Egypt, I believe, and the Seleucids were Syrians. Greeks. Okay. Right. Okay. Nice. Okay. That's it. That's good to know. So we had the Greeks, um, mostly Greeks. But all right, let's go on to the Ptolemies. Roughly 320 BC. So we had this guy named Ptolemy. He was a leader at that time, and he quickly succeeded Alexander's place after he died. And he then apparently seized Jerusalem. He wanted to take it over, but he was friendly to the Jews, right? Let me see here. Now, even though he was friendly to the Jews, a lot of them stayed in Alexandria that Alex had built, and they thrived there. Now, under Ptolemy II, so Ptolemy is succeeded by the second, just imagine two ones there. During that time, the Jews in Alexandria translated the Old Testament into Greek. And they got 6 members from each tribe of Israel, which would make up 72 people who translated this work, which then was known as the Septuagint. I can see the number 7 there in sept. Pretty cool. I didn't know that. So that's what's going on with the Alexandrian Jews. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the Jews also prospered. And they paid tribute tax to the Egyptian government. That's what I learned. However, the high priest had to deal with local affairs. So we had this guy here named Simon the Just, and he really stood out among the high priest as he is credited for rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And he introduced fresh water into the city, fresh water system. So he was a good guy, and he was a great teacher on ancient Judaism, emphasizing observance to the law, divine service, and charity. So he's a guy who really stands out. I guess he earned that title, Simon the Just. And so there's a little bit of prospering with the Jewish nation under the Ptolemies. But then we get the Seleucids, which was, I guess, they succeeded over time. So we had this guy named Seleucus now, who succeeded the Syrian states after Alexander's rule. We have a guy named Antiochus, who succeeded his place. And he fought against Egypt around 2000 BC, and he seized the Palestine from the Ptolemies. So he's taking over control. Now, the Jews there who enjoyed religious freedom, these guys, then had Hellenistic culture enforced on them. So they had to change their ways. So then we have, let me see here, I'm getting lost, by the Seleucids. So then Simon the Just, he is then succeeded by, Onias III, and he was a very strict Orthodox Jew, as I learned. But at that time, his position was taken over by Jason. And Jason at the time was preferred by the Jews because of their liking of Greek culture. And Jason also generously paid tribute to Antiochus, who was the Seleucid leader at that time. Now, Antiochus, who's now the fourth, saw the priesthood as a political office, so he just sort of filled in high priest as he saw fit. But other Jews, the more traditional ones, saw this as an offense against God, so they were very much against that. I believe so, yes. Now, Jason embraced Hellenistic culture that he saw, and he saw traditional Judaism as obsolete. So now we can see more of a separation of these two different Jewish groups, the more modernized ones and the more traditional ones. Jason then appoints Menelaus, and this guy Menelaus is from the tribe of Benjamin, and he makes him the high priest. And he paid more tribute to Antiochus. Antiochus then decides to make a sneak attack on Jerusalem during the Sabbath because he knew that the traditional Jews would not fight because it's a Sabbath. Ended up killing a lot of them, and that eliminated Jason and Menelaus' resistance because he didn't like the traditional Jews. Yes?
From one of the children of Israel.
They would be, but I guess the process of choosing changed over time. That's the only thing I can say about that. It was either influenced by the governors at the time or it was just appointed. But I don't think they would be from anyone outside of the Jewish tribes. So that's all I can say on that. Yes.
Well, they were supposed to be Levites, but because of Hellenism, which is really just Greekness, was spread, and Jason is actually a Greek name, which is interesting, but he was a Jew.
But he loved Hellenistic culture.
Yeah,
He probably
so
changed it.
you see that it's like glomming together. But I don't think we should necessarily see it as a bad thing, because good things also came out of this syncretization.
Yes. I mean, yes, there are good things, but the conflict would increase between the two different Jewish groups because he killed a lot of Orthodox Jews because they wouldn't find the Sabbath. So they're thinking, all right, our resistance is out of the way, but I think as I learned, Jason, Menelaus, and the Hellenistic Jews were a little too ambitious in their quest to eliminate old tradition, because not all Orthodox Jews were willing to die passively. So a lot of them ended up taking arms. And so we get some more conflict now and leading into civil war. So after this, and now since we got different Jewish groups who are against each other, that leads now to the Maccabean revolt, which took place after the Seleucid period, roughly 160 to 135 BC. So here's how it goes. This is what I found this story fascinating. There's a small village outside of Jerusalem called Modin. And it was an emissary of Antiochus, who was a ruler at that time, and arrived and expected Mattathias, who was a high or elderly priest at that time, to perform a pagan sacrifice. All right? So obviously he refused. He didn't want to do this because that's a big no-no for their religion. I think that was a challenge put on by the emissary. But when he refused, another Jew stepped up to do it. So, all right, I'll take care of it. I'll do it. And that prompted Mattathias and his 5 sons to kill that Jew and the emissary. And at that point, they destroyed the pagan altar of the city, and they fled to the hills. Then other Orthodox Jews joined them. Oh, wait a minute. That's the other Jew and the emissaries that they killed. We have other Orthodox Jews who joined Mattathias, and they picked up arms to fight against the Syrians. And they did. They fought against Hellenistic Jews who supported them, leading to civil wars. But again, they wouldn't fight on the Sabbath day, which led to many of them being killed. So Mattathias then makes it lawful for Jews to defend themselves on the Sabbath day. So after Mattathias died, his son Judas takes his place. And he is called the Maccabee, which is a word meaning the hammer. And many of the Jews supported him, which would make these guys the Maccabean Jews. And they were able to fight against the Syrians. They surprise attacked the Syrians and the Hellenistic Jews at night at Emmaus, which we know about in the Word. And then they marched to Jerusalem with all the booty that they seized. And there they cleaned out all the pagan altars and statues. All right? So victory for them, and then to celebrate that victory, they had an 80-day feast called the Festival of Lights, which is known as Hanukkah. I didn't know that was the birthplace of Hanukkah. That's pretty cool. So now they're doing well. The Maccabean Jews are prospering, but soon after we had this guy named Lysias, who was a Syrian general, and he defeated the Maccabees and retook Jerusalem. So there's a lot of back and forth. Poor Jerusalem is just getting pushed around. But due to personal trouble at home, Lysias didn't have time to deal with the Jews, so he decided to make a peace offering. All right, let's not fight anymore. I don't have time for this. So this again allowed Jews more freedom, as the Syrians would not interfere with their internal affairs. But then we have this other guy named Alchemist, who was a Hellenistic Jew, and he was appointed as a high priest. So now we have the modernized Jew in the place of a high priest. But Judas was still unwilling to remain in such conditions. So he left the city with some followers. So he's not going to mingle with the Hellenistic Jews. But then Alchemist ends up killing the rest of the Orthodox population that were in the city, causing Judas and his small army to fight against him. But Judas was outnumbered and killed. So that's the end of him. But then his brother, Jonathan, takes his place. And so he decides to flee across the Jordan with about 100 Maccabean soldiers. And there they would rely more on diplomacy because they were too small of an army to make any kind of effect. So they're going to change tactics and see if they can gain favor through other means. So apparently there were 2 Syrian candidates fighting or competing for the throne at that time. And they both sought help from Jonathan because they could see that he was able to lead a strong army. Jonathan ends up supporting the winning candidate and eventually was able to make treaties with Sparta and Rome, so establishing a little bit more peace in the Jewish territory. And then Jonathan becomes the high priest and the governor of Judea, and he was also a member of the Syrian nobility. That's what I found out. So he's relying on other means to gain advantage for the Jewish nation. Yes?
Because of a battle, and that it's the oil in, I believe in Jerusalem, that lasted so many, I guess it was 7 days, why this? 7 candles.
Oh, you mean for
Based
for
on
Hanukkah?
that is what I was told. They were, well, they were successful with the battle. They held off a lot bigger group.
Yep.
I think they were up on a mountain or something.
Okay. Are there 7 candles though? For 8.
So it
There
was
are
8
8.
candles.
Okay. Well, yeah, I didn't read anything about that though. But at least it was a celebration for a victory.
I think tomorrow is day 2.
Huh?
I think tomorrow is day 2.
Oh, Hanukkah, right? Yes. Okay, more in the Maccabean revolt. Jonathan dies, and Simon takes his place as the high priest. Jonathan recognizes Demetrius as the rightful king of Syria, so I guess he was the one who won. And because he recognized Demetrius, he was able to make Jews exempt from taxation, which was a mark of independence. So more advantage for the Jews. He was also named, Simon was named the leader and high priest forever until there shall arise a faithful prophet. So apparently he's a really good guy. But this led into a new period called the Hasmoneans, which was named after Asmoneus, who was a descendant of the Maccabees. Then after Simon, a guy named John Hyrcanus, or Canaus, succeeded as the head of the Jewish state. Hyrcanus, thank you. Okay, so things are looking okay during this point, but then we get into the Hasmonean period. See the count, the numbers getting lower, 135 to 65 BC. So John Hyrcanus is now in place, and he was recognized by the Syrians as the governor, provided that he stays subject to Syria and helps their military campaigns. But he did have to give up coastal cities, so border changes were happening. But John was able to restore some of those regions, and there we get Edom, which would make very effective trade routes. But again, this became a problem for some of the more traditional Jews because they saw this as a potential for temptation. Now, the Hellenistic Jews, we have 2 different groups now, the Hellenistic Jews and the Maccabean Jews. They were becoming more of a thing of a past. However, their ideas were perpetuated by new groups of people. The Hellenistic Jews then became the Sadducees, and the Maccabean Jews became the Pharisees. Isn't that cool, right?
Not so cool.
So these are the 2 rival Jewish groups now that are taking place. Their origins were from the Hellenizers and the Orthodox Jews, the Maccabean Jews. So, back to John. He has children, but their children are kind of like children today. They don't want to have anything to do with tradition or anything in the past. So they're more modernized. They don't really care much about the things of Hebrew thought and Orthodox. When John died, his son, where is it? Aristobulus, yes. That led to conflict with his other siblings, and he decided to throw his brothers into prison. A lot of conflict with the children. Aristobulus then threw them into prison. All of them there died except one, and we'll learn about him in a little bit. So Aristobulus is now like running things, and at the time he did manage to extend the Judean border back again, north to Mount Lebanon, and he also took the title of king. But he led a very unhealthy lifestyle, so he only was active for about a year. He didn't live too long, so his one remaining brother, called Alexander Janus, took his place. Now, Alexander's going to do some things, but this is kind of interesting because it leads to more conflicts between the 2 various Jewish groups. So Alexander, even though his brother Aristobulus wasn't a good guy, he did continue the expansion of the Judean territory, and a lot of the region became Judaized, except Samaritans. Except the Samaritans. Alexander apparently was very biased and had a contempt for the Pharisees. Didn't like the Pharisees. And that led to more civil war. The Pharisees, they got help from the Syrians in their fight against Alexander. So they're going to oppose him, but they didn't want to fight all the way. They just wanted to make their point. Like, now we're not going to put up with this, but that's enough. So they held off, but at that time, Alexander was ticked off, and he captured the Pharisees who opposed him and crucified 800 of them. It was a drastic measure, but he seemed to regret it at the end of his life. Talked about it on his deathbed. Now, Alexander has a wife named Salome, and she apparently had influence and ruled for some time after his death. So Alexander is now dead. I didn't put a ghost there, just move that over. Salome appoints her son Hyrcanus as leader of the Pharisees. And her other son, Aristobulus, not the same Aristobulus who was before Alexander, he became the military commander for the Sadducees. Right? So Aristobulus, leader of the Sadducees, Hyrcanus, leader of the Pharisees. Salome also had a brother named Simeon, who was a leader of the Pharisees, and he was responsible for the educating of all young boys in Hebrew scriptures. So they're doing some good here, passing along tradition. Now, meanwhile, the Pharisees are still kind of ticked off about those 800 guys that died. So they decide to oppose the Sadducees. We're going to get even now, so let's fight against the Sadducees. So this led to a showdown between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, the brothers. Hyrcanus apparently and the Pharisees surrendered to Aristobulus. And Aristobulus then became both the king and the high priest. But apparently the two of them, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, between these two opposing sides, decided, let's try to be friends. Let's try to work things out. We can make this happen. All right? Yeah? Okay, good. And then comes Pompey. Leading into Pompey. Okay, sorry.
Pompey is a city.
Yes.
Pompey is a guy.
Yeah, okay, that's what I was saying. So that leads into the Roman period. 64 to about 4 BC. Getting closer, right? So Pompey suspected a rebellion. He's here he means business. He's not fooling around. He suspected a rebellion from Aristobulus. So he decides to siege Jerusalem, and there he killed 12,000 Jews. All right? Now, even though he killed a lot of people, he was still respectful of their culture. He didn't touch the Holy of Holies. He didn't mess with any of those things. So he allows worship to continue. Jerusalem then, at this point, was made a tributary for Rome, and the Judean borders were greatly decreased. So those expansions before that took place are now taken back. Hyrcanus from the Sadducees is confirmed as a high priest, and he was also named ethnarch of Judea. All right? Meanwhile, Aristobulus and a number of the captives of the Pharisees were taken to Rome for Pompey's glory. But his son, Aristobulus' son Alexander, managed to escape, and he waged a revolt against Hyrcanus. But that revolt was held off thanks to the aid of the Romans to back Hyrcanus' authority. So he tried, but he didn't get very far. Now, meanwhile, in Edom, a governor named Antipater, he's looking over things, and he's not taking any interest at all in the politics of Judea. And he also fears Aristobulus because he knows he can fight. Rivalries between Edom and Judea increased. So now there's stuff going on with other nations. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar is assassinated, prompting Antipater to show loyalty to the new administration of Cassius, and he collected tribute money for them. And then after Antipater, Herod takes his place. And we know Herod. Let's see here. Herod succeeded him, and he became the procreator of Judea, and he was also promised that he would be king one day, which we know happened. Now, Anthony, who is in Rome, defeats Cassius at Philippi. Here he is. And due to that, Herod changes his loyalty and then bribes his way to Antony's favor. Meanwhile, the Parthians, there's a group of people named the Parthians, occupy the eastern part of the former Persian Empire. They attacked Jerusalem and made Aristobulus' son, Antigonus, where is he? There he is, the high priest and king. This caused, apparently this was a cause for concern for Herod. So Herod flees, now he's the high priest in Jerusalem. This caused Herod to flee to Rome, where he gained favor from Antony and was named the King of the Jews. He was actually given the title King of the Jews from Antony because he was promised that he would be king. And only once the Parthians, who were wiped out at that time, or once the Parthians were wiped out or gone, driven out, then Herod eventually returned to Jerusalem with Roman support, and he entered there officially as king, apparently on a donkey, in the triumphal entry, just like the Lord did previously, later on. So now Herod is in control. Now, we know Herod in the New Testament as the one who was responsible for the killing of all the firstborn males to eliminate any kind of threat or opposition to his throne. He was a cruel king, and apparently he was very cruel to his own family. He had 10 wives, a bunch of children, and if he suspected any kind of disloyalty among them, he would violently remove them.
He killed them.
He killed them, yeah, in other words.
Awful.
Yeah.
It was awful.
Not a good guy, not very well liked, but he did try to gain favor with the Jews. Yes?
I don't see how it can be the same Herod, because Antony died in 30
Okay.
BC, 30 years before birth of the Lord. I think that Herod was our Herod's father,
Maybe a successor, yes.
because I think the Herod of the story is Herod the Second.
Okay. Well, then that might explain things then. I didn't read anything about that, but it totally makes sense to put it that way. But what I'm saying about this Herod, the one who killed all the firstborns, he's a cruel guy, right? He's the one who was against his own family and killed them.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's terrible. He killed his own sons.
Right. But what I did learn about him is that he did try to improve the infrastructure of the place. He brought in new buildings, roads, parks, and marketplaces, and he also tried to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So I don't know how successful he was in that, but we do know that at the time of the Lord's birth, that's who was reigning at the time, Herod. Now, just a little bit more about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, since they're like the last remaining groups of the Jewish church at that time. Tell you a little bit more about the Sadducees at first. The Sadducees were a group of people who had very little in common with the Pharisees at the time, because Pharisees are more traditional, orthodox. Sadducees are more modernized, Hellenistic Jews. The only things that the Sadducees and the Pharisees really had in common was their dislike of the Lord. They didn't like the Lord. The Sadducees sided with political rulers, and that put them in a position of wealth and influence. So the Sadducees were all about power and control. And they had this influence and power, yet they kept themselves detached from the crowds. So there were these like invisible people trying to put their hand in everything and control things. So that meant that they were not very well liked among people. And when you look at their views, there's nothing really positive about them. They didn't believe in the afterlife. They didn't believe in the presence of spirits and angels. So what's the point, right? So there's not really much about them, and they were officially put to an end at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Modern Judaism at this day actually traces their roots back to the Pharisees. I don't think there's any descendants from the Sadducees at this time. So then we get the Pharisees. The Pharisees really are the ones who kept the Jewish church going, the traditional church, that is. But we also know them as the main antagonists in the New Testament and were responsible for the Lord's death. But they had been around for about a century before the Lord's birth. The word Pharisee actually means separated ones, because these are the ones who wanted to disassociate themselves with the corrupting of influence of Hellenism, like their main rivals did, the Sadducees. They did appear more religious than anyone else, and they were strongly devoted to preserving and interpreting and applying the law. So perhaps that's why they had to exist, because they preserved the Old Testament, the word, the written word, all throughout this time. However, the Pharisees were also very meticulous when it came to ceremonial purity. They would keep a very tight boundary between themselves and sinners. All right, so they had a specific way of doing things, which they really held in high esteem. And I learned about this too because they really kept their distance from people who were not associated with them, specifically sinners. They wouldn't accept food from them. They wouldn't even buy things from them. They wouldn't go to their houses, obviously. But every once in a while, they would let a sinner into their house. And even then, they would have to put like ceremonial clothes on the sinner and make them do specific things. In their terms, probably someone who's breaking the law in some way or another or defying their traditions. That's pretty much. But it's funny how the exact same things that they accuse people of doing, they are doing themselves. Derek, you have a question? Right. Right. That's right. Yeah. That's a really good point, actually. So yeah, I mean, I guess you can see the integrity that they have because they're preserving their traditions, but also preserving the word throughout all this time and fighting off all this other influence from other people in different groups, and they've come a long way. So I definitely get your point. Yes, I mean that's exactly why we read about him in the Word. Yes, exactly. That's exactly the point that we should be considering. All right, so even though the Pharisees were very strict and orthodox, traditional, some of them were accepting of Roman rule, seeing that it could be compatible with Jewish customs, where others were strictly opposed to Romans altogether, which I think led on the destruction of Jerusalem eventually in 70 AD. Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, and that's what we'll see. I mean, I did mention that with the Sadducees. The Pharisees did want to have some sort of control because, as I mentioned, they had their ways, but they're also very good at preserving the word and keeping the law going. Now, here's the problem, right? They devoted themselves to the study of the law, right, the word. But their traditions and practices over time were regarded by them as being on the same level as the law itself. And that exactly is the definition of idolatry, when you make something equal to or greater than the word. So this became the basis of most of the Lord's criticisms against them, because they had clearly neglected the point of the law, which was to live a good life, right? But by separating themselves from impurity, they then developed a certain pride in the observance of their practices, right? So you could say maybe pride was the main problem with the Pharisees, whereas power and control was with the Sadducees. Yeah, most of the time, yes. Now, however, not all Pharisees were bad because we do learn of some good ones in the Word, such as Nicodemus in John, and also Joseph of Arimathea, yeah, who provided the tomb for the Lord to be buried. So there are good guys among them. But pride, among many other things, seemed to be the downfall of the Jewish church. So it was actually their pride and their zeal to protect their ways that led them to kill the Lord, right? At which point their traditions and their ways became more important and more authoritative than the word itself. This is actually what did themselves in, when they put themselves higher than the word. And this is also when they were no longer the universal church on the earth, because now they have completely corrupted their ways. And if you are familiar with the crucifixion story, after the Lord died, he said that it is finished. We had the great earthquakes that took place, The temple was then destroyed, and the curtain veil was ripped in two. And that ripping, that tearing of the veil, officially marked that transition. You are no longer a representative church. Your church is now done. You are no longer the universal church. This new church now can begin, the Christian church. So now we have other people here. And these are made up of all sorts of different kinds of people. Some of them are Jews, some of them are just Gentiles. But altogether, these are people who did not want to associate themselves with traditional Jewish custom or traditional custom like that of the Pharisees. So at this point, the Pharisees and their ways are irrelevant because they're no longer the center of the show. And these people would take a liking to the teachings of the Lord and would then become the first members of the early Christian church. And the Christian church then would become the new universal church, which is what the prophets of the Old Testament had prophesied all this time, many centuries ago. And after the establishment of the Christian church, or really the Lord on earth, these people then would eventually spread the word to the entire world. So the Holy Land is no longer the center of the world, the center of the church. The church then is going to be around the entire world itself. And then that actually is the official ending of my presentation, because then we have the Christian church in its place. But yes, plenty of comments. Go ahead.
Well, highly of the main Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Socrates and Plato are kind of together because Socrates didn't write anything down. Plato wrote down what Socrates taught, right? And our church is a Platonic, Neoplatonic church. It was from them that the idea of the spiritual and the natural came down to us. And that was one of the universal concepts that was spread during the Hellenistic era, this Greek era. Alexander, by conquering all that world, set up trade routes everywhere. And so after Christianity gets started, it was those trade routes that allowed these teachings to be spread. And
That's a good. Yeah.
Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle kind of set the stage intellectually they were critical. Yeah. And this whole Hellenistic era was critical for what the Lord needed to accomplish later on.
That's really cool to think about. That sort of lets you observe divine providence even more. And you're talking about the trade routes and everything, and how easily Christianity could spread thanks to that. Right.
So it tremendously helps. What was the language, Gail? Was it Aramaic?
In
Trading.
Probably.
Yeah.
I want to add that apart from Judaism, any of the other religions were just ways to worship the gods so that they didn't do anything bad to you.
Yep.
It had nothing to do with morality.
Yep.
And then if you wanted to have something that you based your life on, you went to philosophy. But just before the Lord's born, we get Isis, the cult of Isis, and we got the cult of Mithras. Both of them, one coming from Egypt, one coming from the Mideast. They're the first time that we see a religion that says, if you lead a good life, something good will happen to you after you die. It's the first time. And they're called mystery religions, but and then, of course, Christianity becomes a mystery religion, but I think they were paving the way, bridging that gap between religion and philosophy.
That's really cool.
Which is what Christianity really did.
Yes.
And their cults became very popular.
Right.
Oh, very popular.
Really
Mithras with soldiers, we still don't know everything that they did because they held it such secret, but these were big religions.
Nice.
But they were held in, people held them with suspicion because they were emotional And religion was really about, oh, are we allowed to conduct business today? No, we're not, because we have to throw beans over our shoulders. You know, to do.
And also those ancient religions that the Lord talks about, it's that all the worshiping of all the pantheisms of gods, and they were different wherever you went. There was no love involved.
Mhm.
They didn't love their gods because the gods were fickle. And so when Christianity comes along and they just have this God that loves them, that was huge.
That was different, yeah.
That was absolutely huge.
That's really cool. Think about that. You know, the introduction to philosophy and these different cults, combining those things, and how that helped Christianity, the idea of Christianity at least. You know, having thought combined with having to live a good life. You know, you need to combine those things. That's really cool. More evidence of divine providence working behind the scenes. Yes.
I get the impression that Alexander the Great wasn't so bad, but actually he was ruthless. Most of the people, kings and so on that were called the Great were great because they were ruthless.
Yeah.
They weren't nice people. And what I see here is the Lord taking this evil man, and I think he was evil, and getting some good, or getting the trade routes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's like speaking to pretty much all the things that was taking place. All the good that came out of it really set the stage for the Christian church to begin and thrive. But it had to happen. You know, even though we have bad people in the scene, they did contribute something toward that establishment of the church.
And you hear about the Pax Romana. It really starts with Augustus around 30 BC, and he gets everything all set up. And all those trade routes can be used because of the Pax Romana.
Mm.
That somebody's in charge and keeping everything down. And the Pax Romana lasts for about 200 years.
Which is amazing.
Which is just the time when Christianity is spreading. And those trade routes allowed Christianity to spread. So many different things going on. And then, you know, after a while, Christians start battling with themselves. And, you know, that's what we do best.
That's another history.
But it's a fascinating period. And I find that this whole judgment on the ancient church to be more interesting than the Last Judgment. Because it's such an example of how the pipeline between the worlds was choked when you've got Herod there killing his Mithridates. It was a wreck.
Yep, totally.
But this whole chaotic situation, Augustus comes in and calms everything down. And that's when the Lord was born.
That was necessary, totally necessary.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's really cool. More stuff like that. Right?
Yeah.
We could go on forever talking about all the things that went on. It just confirms even more and more how much divine providence really is at work all the time. And that divine activity is, in a sense, perceived when you consider how everything was put together and how everything came together in time to set things up so well. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Derek?
Just one more comment for me. As I was watching this, and obviously this is a super zoomed in view of the land of Israel, but you talk about these other empires that came through and Israel was sort of in the middle of it. These were massive empires, and it's just fascinating to me looking at the centuries and even millennia before the Lord was born, and all these workings going on in that area with these empires, gaining power, losing power, and this little insignificant piece of land is basically what ends up, and this one slightly insignificant point in time where the Lord was born and then was preaching, when so much more was going on the planet. And boom, that one point in time spreads throughout the entire world,
Right.
And is the biggest religion there is. It's just fascinating to me. You know, again, we're zoomed in, but it's just the Syrians, the Romans, those are huge, huge empires.
Yep.
And the Jewish nation is what started it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And they thrived all throughout that. Yes.
It's really easy to predestination and providence
Mm.
in all of this.
Yeah.
And you could listen to everything you said and say, well, the Lord rigged it all to make it happen, as opposed to thinking about how providence provides opportunities and it fit the circumstances, or however you want to look at it. But it's a danger to think that this was rigged
Right.
in the way that it had to happen this way. Well, it was provided he foresaw what was going to happen. Providence provided
Yeah.
all the opportunities.
Right. Absolutely. And not at any point did he violate anyone's freedom, too, in doing so. If it were rigged, like you said, then no one would have freedom and be able to do anything at all.
That's why it's important to think about how providence operates.
Yeah.
And not confuse it
Right.
with having it all rigged.
Yep.
So that our life is not in freedom.
Exactly. That's a very important point, and that's still true today, too. Has to be. All right. Well, thank you very much. It was fun doing this, but I kind of need a break now, so
Thank you, Brian.
you're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your week. Well, there you go. I hope this was some sort of an answer, at least the beginning of an answer.